Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 513. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone, today joined by co-host Connor Freeman. Connor, how you doing?
Doing well, Kyle. How are you?
Doing very well, Connor. And right now at the Libertarian Institute, we are in the middle of our end of the year fundraiser. We only look for money twice a year. We are able to produce really good content at the Libertarian Institute in large part because, we're reader funded there. So we don't have any big donors giving us an agenda or anything like that. We cover what we think is important. And so, I have the freedom to spend all this time covering the Israel-Palestine conflict because of the donations that we get at the Libertarian Institute. So if you can, head on over, make a contribution. Right now, we do have matching funds. We had a very generous donor in the Bitcoin community offer us $10,000 in matching funds, which is absolutely excellent. So if you would like to not only support the Institute, but double the impact of your support, head on over and make a donation now. Lots of great content at the Libertarian Institute. Brand new books this year by Keith Knight, Tom Woods, and James Bovard. Look for Scott Horton's book on the Ukraine war next year. And of course, the Libertarian Institute is the host of this podcast, The Scott Horton Show, and a lot of other really great content. So, Connor, with that, let's get into today's news. First story up here. Senate passes massive $886 billion National Defense Authorization Act. So on Wednesday, the Senate passed the mammoth $886 billion 2024 NDAA, which funds the Pentagon and its military spending and other government agencies. The bill passed with a vote of 87-13 with 6 Democrats and 6 Republicans and 1 independent voting against it. This NDAA has now heads to the House, where it is expected to pass in a vote on Thursday, as the bill is the version that the two chambers negotiated. The NDAA includes an amendment to extend Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which is FISA, which gives the FBI the power to conduct warrantless spying on foreign targets and Americans they interact with. Section 702 has enabled mass surveillance of Americans and is set to expire at the end of the year, but the extension pushes that back to April 19th. And so, Connor, I'm not even sure how they're able to just tack things on to the NDAA that have nothing to do with the Pentagon whatsoever. But I guess just this is the way Congress works now, where they could kind of do what they want. Very disappointing to see that. Usually, Connor, we do a lot more on the NDAA and coverage of it on this show, but just with the war in Israel and the war in Ukraine, that has been, I feel like, the majority of our focus, and for that reason, we haven't really covered the kind of development of the NDAA this year. So if it does get passed, I'm certainly going to spend some time picking through it and trying to find what's in it. One, I think probably the most important thing in that bill for the audience and what they're going to want to know is there is $300 million in funding for Ukraine in that legislation. And my understanding from the White House is, Connor, is that they're down to the last $1 billion, and they expect to use that over the course of the next 2 weeks here before the end of the year. And so this would probably allow the White House to have funding for Ukraine into the first week of January, when Congress returns from their winter break, because we have heard from several senators just come out and flatly say that they are not going to pass the Ukraine aid, this massive bill, before the end of the year. So this will give them a little bit of time after the end of the year to pass that legislation without completely exhausting aid should the NDAA pass. All right, Connor, next up here, Financial Times. U.S. and China planning a series of senior level military summits in 2024. The Financial Times reports that people familiar with the situation said the U.S. and China were negotiating a series of senior-level military engagements for 2024 after the Pentagon submitted an initial proposal to Beijing, but they cautioned that arranging the series of engagements they are hoping for would take time, partly for bureaucratic reasons. A senior defense official told the outlet, "This is not about making something happen overnight. This is about ensuring that defense and military leaders from our two countries countries, including at the most senior levels, can have substantive conversations. U.S. defense officials told the Financial Times that it was in regular communication with Chinese officials. We are negotiating these details not publicly. We are working on this deliberately because across the U.S. government, we all want to get this right. So this is all interesting, Connor, and I kind of am a little bit doubtful of this story in general because earlier this month, Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Christopher Grady, said the U.S. and China had not resumed military-to-military communications during an Atlantic Council event. He said that the Americans were waiting for the Chinese to initiate those conversations. Now, one of the reasons I'm skeptical, Connor, is that this article, if you read it from Financial Times, they really highlight this meeting that happened before the Biden-Xi summit. So I think that's really important because at that summit, there was an agreement to resume military-to-military communications between the two sides. But like as my assumption was, that what Grady said earlier this month at the Atlantic Council event was the situation where those talks had not resumed yet. And they kind of painted it as these talks were going on. And we know that because this meeting happened before the Biden-Xi summit. And especially since there's been a lot of very important developments to China since then, not necessarily to the Americans. Even on this show, we've been very much more focused on the situation in the Middle East and Ukraine, in Taiwan, far more than what's happening with the Philippines and the South China Sea. But there's been a lot of confrontation there, and it's very provocative to China, and Americans just don't understand it. So this from Dave DeCamp here, antiwar.com, December 10th. China-Philippines trade accusation over collision in South China Sea. Chinese and Philippines vessels collided near a disputed reef in the South China Sea as tensions in the water could continue to rise. The China and the Philippines traded blame over the incident, which took place near the Second Thomas Shoal, where Chinese and Philippines vessels have frequently had intense encounters. The incidents typically occur when the Philippines attempts to resupply a World War II era Philippine ship that is grounded on the reef. And if you actually look at a picture of it, Connor, it's unbelievable what they're fighting over. It's just an old rusty boat in very shallow water. And of course, for some reason, there feels to be a need of the Americans to intervene in this. And so the Chinese Coast Guard said the Philippines vessel ignored multiple serious warnings and infringed on the international regulations for preventing collisions in sea by taking a sudden turn in an unprofessional and dangerous way. And this happens a lot, Connor, in the South China Sea, where there's kind of disputes over which vessel needs to, take maneuvers to get out of the way on the other, and then both sides claim the other is acting in an unprofessional way. There actually are very well-written rules about who is supposed to yield to who on the high seas and who's supposed to change directions and how far away you're supposed to do that. Kind of like how there's rules of when you're supposed to use your blinker and how soon before you turn you're supposed to turn it on. All those things do exist on the sea as well. So, I have no idea in this particular instance who's at fault here, but there are rules, and at a time when there's not so much news to cover, maybe we could get into something like that. Next up here, the U.S. sanctions two Chinese officials for what they call serious human rights abuses against the Uyghurs. Secretary of State Antony Blinken announced two Chinese officials have been blacklisted for serious human rights abuses against the Uyghurs. He said, with today's actions, the United States is addressing some of the most challenging and harmful forms of human rights abuses in the world. Additionally, three Chinese firms were barred from exporting goods to the U.S. The companies are blacklisted and accused of forced labor. And kind of interesting, Connor, sometimes I talk to people about this, how when there seems to be maybe some stories in the news that are beneficial, maybe not beneficial towards China, but just don't paint China in quite such a negative light. I believe it was some auditors from Volkswagen found that their plant in China did not use any kind of forced labor. That just a couple days after that, we have this story come out that says the U.S. is sanctioning China because they're using forced labor. And so it really seems like this is maybe a little bit of narrative control. Also interesting, in the article published by Radio Free America, which is, of course, U.S. funded state media, it heavily cites the work of Adrian Zenz, who our colleague at the Libertarian Institute, Patrick McFarlane, along with others such as Garrett Porter, Matt Blumenthal, and some other great reporters at the Gray Zone, have exposed him to be an absolute fraud. All right, next up here. Israel tries to disable Hamas tunnels with seawater. Israeli forces have begun pumping seawater into tunnels under Gaza. A U.S. official said it will be a weeks-long process, but Israel may have started attempting to flood the tunnels last month. So last month, I guess they had 2 pumps set up. Now they have 5. I'm not sure how large the pumps are and how many tunnels they're flooding. From my understanding, Connor, the Hamas tunnel networks are vast. They have blast doors, and there's a lot of different ones as well. So I'm not sure that this is actually even meant to disable the Hamas tunnels in the long term. My guess is that the goal is what we found in the past when Egypt tried this tactic, is that it caused complaints from nearby farmers for making their land less fertile. So maybe it's just another kind of ethnic cleansing tactic on the part of the Israelis. Next up here, this is from the Middle East Eye. Hamas leadership say losses lower than Israeli claims. Israel claims that 5 Hamas senior commanders have been killed and 7,000 of its fighters and thousands of others have been captured. A source close to Hamas leadership said those claims are exaggerations. A source told Middle East Eye that the number of casualties among Hamas fighters was very low. The source estimated that the total number of casualties is below 10%. And so, that's probably a definite low estimate, Connor, but 10% would be 3,000 to 4,000, which really wouldn't be that much out of line with the initial Israeli estimate at the beginning of the ceasefire of 1,000 to 2,000. And so, it could be that the total casualties for Hamas are around 10%. The Hamas, the source close to the Hamas said Hamas's military wing is a military movement with a centralized structure and a loose organizational ring. We have not heard that central forces have suffered serious casualties, except for some commanders who were outside the tunnels because of the fighting. And a former House fighter explained the tactics of the group would deploy, and they said what is happening now in Gaza is a kind of guerrilla warfare. It is unnecessary to risky to mobilize and force thousands for this war. For hit and run operations, fast few man teams are enough. These teams are also very small in terms of targets and minimize casualties. And so what they're saying, Connor, is that 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 Hamas members will strike an Israeli group of soldiers at a time. But when you're talking about a 40,000 man, a 30,000 man fighting force, that really is a very, very small percentage of their total fighters. And so that they would be able to maintain this for a quite a substantial amount of time. Now, I'm sure another thing that's going on, and there may even be some confusion about, Connor, is, there may be some people in Gaza who are basically standing on their front lawns, and if they have a gun, they're going to shoot the people that are invading them. And I'm sure that every single one of those people who really, if you're a male over the age of, I would say 14, 13, maybe a big 12-year-old would even get lumped into being a militant. But, if you're a male and you're generally resisting what Israel is doing here, whether that means firing an RPG at an Israeli tank, or I don't know, being a little something in America that would get listed as resisting arrest, my guess is that the Israelis are going to chalk your death up to being a Hamas fighter. And so I'm guessing that Israel is counting some people as Hamas that simply aren't Hamas here. But this is just interesting to get the Hamas side, what they think their losses are, because we've really only seen the Israeli numbers of what they report so far, which was initially 1,000 to 2,000 and then magically increased to 5,000, even though those two numbers were given during the ceasefire, and now they say it's up to 7,000. Matt Blumenthal also raised questions about whether thousands of Hamas fighters would really stop fighting. He estimates that most of the people being labeled as Hamas fighters that are captured are just civilians. All right, next up here, Gaza healthcare system on its knees as experts warn disease will spread. So, international humanitarian agencies are warning that Gaza's healthcare system is near collapse as Israeli military operations had disabled most of the besieged enclave's hospitals. The devastation in Gaza is causing disease to spread. Israeli experts warned that the epidemics could begin circulating in Israel. So, the director of the World Health Organization, the WHO, said there are signals of epidemic diseases in Gaza, including bloody diarrhea and jaundice. He added that Gaza's healthcare system is, quote, on its knees and collapsing. The WHO representative in Gaza explained the Israeli military occupation in Gaza has decimated the healthcare facilities. He said since Israel began military operations in Gaza, the healthcare system has gone from 36 functioning hospitals to 11 partly functioning hospitals, one in the north and 10 in the south. And Connor, I think, just so people understand here, a partly functioning hospital would be a hospital that, say, has electricity, water, medicine. Some of the hospitals and medical facilities we're going to talk about on the show are hospitals where the doctors and the patients can't stand up because they'll be shot by sniper fire. And so while that building, it does have some medical care going on in it, it's not even a partially functioning hospital, right? So just to kind of make sense of all of this, the Israeli Defense Forces are making it nearly impossible for doctors to save lives. In northern Gaza, Israeli soldiers are arresting dozens of doctors and firing on medical convoys. The outbreak of disease in Gaza is caused by the Israeli destruction of infrastructure and the restriction of aid. And Environmental Protection Ministry Director General and a former Environmental Protection Ministry Director General and today a researcher at the Institute for National Security Studies, is studying the problem and says the issue of sanitation and sewage is the biggest of them all. The moment that the majority of the population is crowded into densely populated areas, ensuring the continued operation of wastewater treatment facilities and sewage system is critical. Sewage overflows bring disease and epidemics that can reach us. We know that in northern Gaza, the wastewater treatment facility stopped working because the fuel was diverted away. Israel is pushing hundreds of thousands of Palestinians into 10 cities with no water, food, or bathrooms. A resident of one of the regions of Gaza deemed a safe zone by Israel said, there are no toilets. People relieve themselves wherever they can. Some leave the camp and head to nearby hospitals to use their facilities. The WHO Director General described the hygiene situation at UN shelters as, on average, there is one shower unit for every 700 people and one toilet for every 150 people. And there are worrying signs of epidemic diseases, including bloody diarrhea and jaundice. A professor and the director of emergency medicine program at the Ben-Gurion University's School of Public Health predicted the disease will spread from Palestinians in Gaza to Israelis. He said, I estimate that within a few weeks, we'll begin to feel it in Israel. Initially, it will be in the southern locales, and then it will begin to spread by the soldiers who get infected and pass diseases along to their families. And Connor, is kind of disturbing that they're raising the alarm, not because, an epidemic in Gaza could really kill a lot of people, right? When you're only eating a meal 1 out of every 3 days, you don't have any clean drinking water, and then you get a disease like a viral disease that has bloody diarrhea, and you can't go to the hospital to get additional fluids, then that could kill you. But if you're in Israel and you get, a really nasty bug, that isn't good. That's unfortunate, but you're going to go to the hospital and get treatment. It's not going to kill you. And so, it should be far more alarming for the people in Gaza that this is going on. Next up here, IDF fires on ambulance in Gaza and arrests medical staff. The international aid organizations issued a report that their staff attempting to provide medical assistance to the people of Gaza are facing abuse from Israeli Defense Forces, the IDF. The IDF fired on a World Health Organization medical convoy. A senior doctor at the hospital in northern Gaza says dozens of medical staff have been arrested. According to the WHO statement on December 9th, a World Health Organization team that involved other groups, including the Palestinian Red Crescent, the UN Office for the Coordination of Human Affairs, and the UN Department for Safety and Security, committed a high-risk mission to the Al-Ali Hospital in Gaza City to deliver medical supplies, assess the situation in the hospital, and transfer critically injured patients to a hospital in the south. On the way north, this is all from the statement. On the way north, the UN convoy was inspected at the Wadi Gaza checkpoint, and the ambulance crew had to leave vehicles for identification. 2 of the staff were detained for over an hour. WHO staff saw one of them being made to kneel at gunpoint and taken out of sight, where he was reportedly harassed, beaten, stripped, and searched. As the mission entered Gaza City, the aid truck carrying the medical supplies and one of the ambulances were hit by bullets. The convoy faced additional harassment as it attempted to move patients to South Gaza. The statement says, on the way back towards southern Gaza with patients from the Al-Ali hospital on board, the convoy was again stopped in the Wadi checkpoint, where staff were and most patients had to leave the ambulances for security checks. And remember, Connor, these are the most critically ill patients, and this is the same convoy that just passed this same checkpoint, and they're doing that to these people. It says one of the same 2 staff temporarily detained earlier on the way was taken in for interrogation a second time. The idea of treatment of the aid convoy may have led to the death of one of the patients. The Red Crescent staff reported afterwards that during the transfer process, one of the injured patients died as a result of his untreated wounds. Another hospital in North Gaza had its medical staff arrested by the IDF. Dr. Hossam Abu Saifa, the head of the pediatrics at the Kalma Aldwin Hospital, told CNN that 70 medical staff, including the director of the hospital, had been detained in an unknown location by Israeli soldiers. The doctor said the hospital was barely functioning. The IDF asked us to gather in one section or building and close all the doors and windows, and not to be near doors or windows, adding that the Israeli soldiers only allowed 5 doctors to remain at the hospital. The rest were arrested. The WHO statement described an equally troubling situation at the Al-Ali hospital. The statement said that the hospital was described by WHO staff as utter chaos and humanitarian disaster zone. It is extremely congested with many displaced people and over 200 patients. While it only has enough resources to support 40 beds, half of its original bed capacity, the building has sustained substantial damage because of the hostilities. A monitoring manager at the Al-Wada hospital, this is a 3rd facility, spoke with Jacobin about the deplorable conditions at the facility. The source said the hospital is surrounded by snipers who have killed 3 staff members. He said that there was limited food and water because Israel bombed the water tanks. The hospital has been under total siege for a week. Doctors Without Borders said the siege came without warnings. Doctors speaking with WHO staff said the situation is beyond control and they face shortages of fuel, oxygen, and essential medicine supplies, as well as a lack of food and water for patients and care themselves. Adding, health staff is completely minimal, nursing care is extremely limited, and the hospital is relying heavily on volunteers. The WHO representative in Gaza explained the Israeli military operations in Gaza have decimated the healthcare facilities. In just 66 days, the system has gone from 36 functional hospitals to 11 partly functional hospitals. And then, the WHO Director General said the potential epidemic. Next up here, Connor, is this Reporters Without Borders. 2023 has been a catastrophic due to the massacre of journalists in Gaza. The president of RSF Spain said This 2023 has been a catastrophic year due to the massacre of journalists in Gaza, which we will not begin to forget. A study by RSF of violence in Israel since October 7th found 17 journalists, those 13 in Gaza, 3 in Lebanon, and 1 in Israel, died while in the line of duty. In total, over 60 journalists have been killed, almost all in Gaza. However, Reporters Without Borders has not determined if they were killed while covering the conflict yet. RSF says the deaths show an unprecedented scale of tragedy for journalism in Gaza. So just a horrific thing that the Israelis are doing to the journalists in Gaza. Next up here from Day to Camp at antiwar.com, U.S. has no plans to restrict military aid to Israel, despite Biden calling Gaza bombing indiscriminate. We covered the Biden statement on the last show, but now we have a U.S. officials telling CNN that the aid is going to go on. One official said the U.S. does not consider the death of civilians a violation of the laws of war unless they are purposefully targeted. White House National Security Council spokesperson John Kirby claimed on Wednesday that Israel stated their intent to reduce civilian casualties, and they have acted on that. When pressed on President Biden's comments calling Israelis' bombing campaign indiscriminate, Kirby refused to say if that was the U.S. government's official position. The president was expressing his concerns, again, as I said, about the civilian casualties that we've seen, and again, it's reflective in our consistent efforts to urge the Israelis to be as precise and careful as possible. In the same speech where Biden called the Israeli bombing indiscriminate, he vowed to continue supporting the Israeli bombing campaign. Connor, it doesn't look like we're going to get talks anytime soon. The Israeli war cabinet rejected an offer from the Mossad chief to head to Qatar to begin and restart hostage negotiation talks with the Israelis. One of the really interesting notes here was that the reason the Israelis didn't think it was effective is they feel that Hamas in the Gaza Strip is effectively completely cut off from the Hamas leadership in Qatar. All right. Next up here, Dave DeCamp. Israel says Gaza onslaught will continue with or without our world support. So the Israeli Foreign Minister Eli Cohen said on Wednesday that the brutal Israeli assault on Gaza will continue with or without global support after the UN General Assembly voted overwhelmingly in support of a ceasefire. Cohen said Israel will continue with the war against Hamas with or without international support. A ceasefire at the current stage is a gift to the terrorist organization Hamas and will allow it to return and threaten the residents of Israel. Connor, it's amazing how many people are still just completely against the ceasefire. Really, really atrocious stuff. All right, next up here is one more article that I wrote for the Institute yesterday, December 13th. IDF signals coming conflict with Lebanon. In an interview with Newsweek, an unnamed Israeli Defense Forces official signaled that Tel Aviv was seeking a larger conflict with Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. The IDF and Hezbollah have traded fire along the Israeli-Lebanese border since October 7th, killing scores of people. A larger conflict could draw the U.S. onto the side of Israel. An IDF official told Newsweek, "We will not return to the situation that was on the 6th of October in the north. It means we will not allow our civilians, neither in Gaza envelope nor on the Lebanese border, to be under this threat." The official said that the focus is on Gaza, but the IDF is ready to fight against Lebanon. We are prepared for that. We are alert for that. We have the people, the personnel that is exactly ready for that, but we do not want to do that yet. And so, Connor, the thing for Israel just seems to be timing at this point. Now, the U.S. has dispatched a couple officials to Tel Aviv to try to tamp down the tensions. And I just saw, I believe it was in the Financial Times, another report that the U.S. really doesn't want things to escalate with Hezbollah, because they have pretty much explicitly said that they will enter the war on behalf of Israel at that point. But this could be the real nightmare situation. And it seems like Israel does want that war, just not yet. Now, Israel's bombing of Lebanon has been pretty brutal. Israel used U.S. supplied white phosphorus in an attack on southern Lebanon. This was a report in the Washington Post. And Connor, while I'd like to say that this war crime may alter U.S. support for Israel, John Kirby, I believe it was, who said, we'll look into that, which means they're not going to do that. And then, of course, here we have Israel killing a 80-year-old Lebanese mayor. Hassan Mansour was killed in his home in the village that he was mayor of, and it was an Israeli shell that killed him. And then one more story here before I turn over to you, Connor. We had another ship attacked by the Houthi in the Red Sea. This time there were two skiffs first that tried to board the ship. When that didn't work, the Houthis launched two missiles, and then a drone. The drone was shot down by the USS Mason, and the U.S. said that the ship continued on its way with no damage or injuries to the crew. All right, Connor, let me know what you got here.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're looking at further escalation here with this war as Netanyahu's government is making threats that they're going to intervene directly against the Houthis, which is what we were talking about last week, that piece in Politico about how the White House was insisting to them, no, we'll take care of the Houthis. We don't want to escalate this thing further unless we have to. We're going to, there's a lot of talk, as we'll get into, about, redeclaring the Houthis as a foreign terrorist organization, having the State Department go ahead and do that, which would totally exacerbate the humanitarian crisis in Yemen. It was it was practically giving the whole territory of northern Yemen, 70 to 80% of the population there, who's still, the vast majority of them are relying on aid after all these years of bombing civilian infrastructure and the blockade, the brutal blockade that the Saudis and the Americans had imposed. It was a death sentence because it would prevent any aid agencies, any humanitarian groups from anybody in the world from doing business with northern Yemen, where the Houthis have held power since 2015. So this is Tashi Hanegbi, who's a former settlement minister, Likudnik, huge Iran hawk, came in when Netanyahu first came back to power in December. He was the one yelling about how, we may just go to war with Iran this time. That's what Bibi's been, that's his destiny, basically. And so this guy's a huge hawk. He's the Israeli National Security Advisor. This one's from Dave DeCamp on December 10th. Netanyahu's National Security Advisor says Israel ready to act against Houthis. So Hanegbi said on Saturday that Israel was ready to act against the Houthis in Yemen if the U.S. and its allies are not. He told Israel's Channel 12, Israel's giving the world some time to organize in order to prevent this, but if there isn't to be a global arrangement because it is a global issue, we will act in order to remove this naval siege. The Houthis have been targeting Israeli-linked commercial vessels and firing missiles and drones at Israel in response to the Israeli onslaught on Gaza. Hanegbi's comments come after reports that said Biden's administration, I mentioned earlier, told them, no, leave the Houthis to us. Now, U.S. officials have told Politico that the Biden administration is not planning to strike the Houthis, at least for now. The U.S. has backed a Saudi-led coalition in the war against the Houthis since 2015, although a ceasefire has held relatively well since April of 2022. There have been no cross-border attacks from either side. So any U.S. attacks on the Houthis could, of course, threaten that truce. Now, for the time being, the U.S. is looking to form an international naval task force to get its allies to help protect commercial shipping in the Red Sea. The Houthis have shown no sign of backing down, as they warn that they will target any ships that are bound for Israel. So on Sunday, the French military said that a French frigate shot down 2 drones in the Red Sea that were fired from Yemen. And the situation in Yemen and the Red Sea is just one area where Israel's assault on Gaza is spilling into the region. As Dave says here, Israel and Hezbollah have been trading fire across Israel's northern border, and Israeli officials, as we were just discussing, are threatening war in Lebanon if Hezbollah does not move back from the border. So when asked if there was a chance of war in Lebanon, Hanegbi said the situation in the north must be changed, and it will change. If Hezbollah agrees to change things via diplomacy, very good, but I don't believe it will. Of course, Israel won't either. So Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has threatened major destruction in Beirut if the situation with Hezbollah escalates into a full-blown war. Netanyahu said if Hezbollah decides to open an all-out war, then with its own hands it will turn Beirut and southern Lebanon, which are not far from here, into Gaza and Khan Yunis, which is the largest um, city in southern Gaza. Now, Axios reported last month that some U.S. officials were concerned that Israel might purposely provoke Hezbollah as a pretext to launch a wider war in Lebanon. And it's possible that the same thing could be the case here with the Houthis. It's certainly, because the Houthis make up an important part of the axis of resistance. I mean, all this propaganda we've been hearing for years and years about Iran arming the Houthis was debunked several times by the great Gareth Porter and other journalists. But of course, you'd have to get it all through the blockade in the first place, and it was on its face absurd. However, the Houthis are politically supported by Iran and certainly their allies in the resistance axis. So you're talking about Hamas, the Shiite militias in Iraq and Syria, for all intents and purposes, Damascus itself, and certainly the Quds Force and Tehran in the region. And so uh, this is a very dangerous situation, and I imagine the last thing Iran wants is for the Houthis to escalate further and to get into it directly with Israel. But if that happens, Iran is going to have to make some serious choices about how to respond. If things kick off with the Houthis and Hezbollah roughly around the same time, one could just necessitate the other. This could be a major headache for the United States, and we could see American forces getting killed pretty quick. Okay, this next story: Houthis claim missile attack on Norwegian flagged ship in the Red Sea. So this is from the 12th. This is Dave again. Yemen's Houthis have taken credit for a missile attack on a Norwegian flagged tanker in the Red Sea. The group's latest operation aimed at disrupting shipping in response to Israel's assault on Gaza. The Houthis, formerly known as Ansar Allah, claimed the ship, the Strinda, was headed to Israel while the vessel's operator and ship tracking data said it was bound for Italy. And the attack came after the Houthis warned all ships in the area that were sailing to Israel are potential targets. So the Strinda was struck as it passed the Bab al-Mandeb Strait, which separates Yemen and East Africa. Houthi spokesman Brigadier General Yahya Saree said that the Houthi forces fired on the ship after it rejected all warning calls. Now, according to Central Command, U.S. CENTCOM. The Strinda reported damage but no casualties. CENTCOM said there were no U.S. ships in the area at the time of the attack, but the U.S. Navy destroyer USS Mason responded to the Strinda's SOS call and was, quote, rendering assistance. So the latest Houthi attack on shipping comes as Israel's warning that it will take action against the group if the allies do not, of course. And so this next story is what I was talking about earlier about invoking this, just declaring the Houthis to be a foreign terrorist organization, which, as I said, would lead to starvation very quickly once again in Yemen, because about 66% of the population is still desperately reliant on aid. What is being allowed through, at least now with this period of certainly of vastly eased tensions since the peace deal in April of last year. So, U.S. threatens to kill Yemen peace deal over Houthi attacks on Red Sea shipping. So the U.S. is threatening to kill a peace plan for Yemen that was negotiated between the Houthis and the Saudis if the Houthis continue attacking shipping in the Red Sea, which the group has been doing in response to Israel's bombing campaign in Gaza. Now, The Guardian reported that the Houthis and Saudis reached a peace deal that could satisfy all major parties involved, including the Southern Transition Council, which is the group backed by the UAE, which would like to see a restoration of a split in the country, because Yemen used to be two countries, North and South Yemen. This is before the unification in 1990. So apparently, the peace plan has been presented to the UN. The details have not been disclosed to the public, but according to The Guardian, the agreement involves three phases. And the first, a potential U.S. plan to redesignate the Houthis as a foreign terrorist organization could prevent the first phase from being implemented. And the first phase involves reopening the seaports and the airports fully. And then this is another major sticking issue between the two sides. The salaries for the civil workers, civil salaries for workers in Houthi-controlled areas, they're going to be compensated with money that is deposited into accounts by the Saudis, I imagine. And so this would be completely impossible to do. The compensation from the two sides here and the lifting of the siege would be impossible. There would be no way any international businesses could do transactions with the Houthis for fear of walking into this minefield set up by the Treasury Department, and facing just an economic onslaught from the United States government. So a U.S. terrorist designation would mean that any entity that does business with the Houthis would be subject to American sanctions, making both steps impossible to implement without the parties involved facing penalties. So the White House said last month that it was considering redesignating the Houthis as terrorists in response to the attacks in the Red Sea and the Houthi missile launches toward Israel. The Trump administration labeled the Houthis as terrorists in January of 2021, but that move was quickly reversed by Biden due to warnings from aid groups that it would doom food-deprived Yemenis living in Houthi-controlled areas. Yemenis have had some relief as the ceasefire reached in April of 2022 has held relatively well. The blockade has been eased somewhat, but according to the UN, as I said, about 2/3 of the population is reliant on aid, and until the deal is implemented, there's always the risk of the war reigniting. So especially if the U.S. or Israel bomb the Houthis in response to attacks in the Red Sea. The Guardian report said that the U.S. warning to the Houthis demonstrates, quote, the price the U.S. is willing to pay to continue supporting Israel's brutal assault on Gaza, which has killed at least 18,000 Palestinians, including over 7,000 children. That sounds very much like Madeleine Albright on 60 Minutes talking about how 500,000 kids starving to death in Iraq is worth it. Okay, so this next story, Houthi official says Gaza ceasefire is the only way to restore calm in the Red Sea. And this is from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com again on the 13th. So a Houthi official came back and said on Wednesday that the only way to restore calm here in the Red Sea is through a ceasefire in the Gaza Strip, amid reports of more Houthi attacks in the waters. So Yemen's Houthi movement, formerly known as Ansar Allah, has been targeting commercial vessels in the Red Sea. These are Israeli-linked ships or ships that are bound for Israel, and they fired missiles and drones at Israeli territory. But this is Abdul Malik al-Arjri, who said he's a member of the Houthis' Politico Bureau. And according to Al Mayadeen, the outlet, he said there's no way of preventing the escalation except by moving towards a permanent ceasefire in the Gaza Strip. See, the U.S. has been considering building that naval coalition, an international naval coalition with its partners to patrol the waters of Yemen's coast. But Arjri said that even if all the fleets in the world gathered in the Red Sea, it would not bring security to Israel or Israeli ships, not to any ships heading to Israel, he said. So also on Wednesday, a U.S. military official told Reuters that, this is talking about the USS Mason apparently shooting down a drone that was headed in its direction as it was responding to an attack on that commercial vessel. This is another commercial vessel, the tanker Ardmore Encounter. And the official said the Houthis attacked the tanker with skiffs and fired 2 missiles that missed. So this is that story that Kyle was referencing earlier. And the Biden administration is threatening to kill a peace plan between the Saudis and the Houthis, of course, as we just discussed. So they're making it pretty clear. The only way to de-escalate here is for the U.S. to use its leverage with Israel and force them to, call for really probably a unilateral ceasefire. There has to be some sort of negotiations, which I think the regional countries would be very interested in and probably are trying to make happen behind the scenes. But of course, Biden's administration and the Congress are just completely beholden to the Israel lobby. So this next story, this is the only good news I have today. Syria appoints new envoy to Saudi Arabia after 11 years. This is from the Cradle. So Syrian President Bashar al-Assad has appointed Ayman Susan, the current deputy foreign minister, as the new ambassador to Saudi Arabia. And this comes after a restoration of diplomatic relations between the two countries after over 10 years of estrangement. So according to the state-owned news outlet Sana, Susan was officially sworn into the ambassador position on December 6th. Assad and the Saudi foreign minister Faisal bin Farhan al-Saad were present during the ceremony. This development marks the appointment of the first Syrian ambassador to the kingdom since 2012. During the ceremony, Maher Badur was also appointed as Syria's ambassador to Algeria. So in 2012, Saudi severed diplomatic relations with Syria, citing the government's harsh crackdown on anti-government protests, and then became one of the main backers of the dirty war with the CIA and the Israelis and Turkey and Qatar all on board, basically arming and funding al-Qaeda affiliates to wage a regime change war against Damascus that failed, but actually led to the Islamic State's caliphate, which blew over into Western Iraq, of course. And in June, Where this is after, of course, this is all sort of in the wake, of course. We've been covering this all year of the real peace deal, not like the Abraham Accords phony, arms sales that are celebrated constantly in in American press. The Chinese came in and actually made a real peace deal in March between, it was unprecedented, between the Saudis and the Iranians, and then that led to Syria being brought in from the cold in May when they were they were readmitted into the Arab League, which they had been kicked out of for more than a decade. And yeah, so this is anyway. It's very interesting to see. It's very good to see that the war has in Gaza and all these tensions in the region. I mean, honestly, it's just showing that the multipolar moment is only going to accelerate, or at least the disintegration of any of these unipolar moment fantasies our officials are still holding on to, especially like in the Biden administration, for instance. I mean, these policies of doubling down on this unconditional support for Israel is isolating us on the world stage, perhaps more than ever. Losing a lot of goodwill if we had any left, especially in this part of the world. And so, yeah, Saudi Arabia is still moving forward with its new relationship with Syria and with Iran. So, this is not looking good. I mean, what they wanted was a deal with Israel and Saudi Arabia so they could prepare for a future war with Iran and keep throwing the Palestinians under the bus. They were ready to, hand Saudi Arabia a defense commitment akin to our defense commitment, mutual defense commitment with Japan. But all that seems to be out the window, and Saudi Arabia is moving forward with making its own, having its own foreign policy independent from the United States in the region. So that's a good sign. And also that Syria is being, as I said, brought in from the cold. They're going to need hundreds of billions of dollars to rebuild their country after this terrible war the U.S. waged against it. And they still occupy a third of the country. Anyway, so this next story. Now, this is, again, we're getting more international attention on these brutal attacks and murders, mass murders of Palestinians in the West Bank. With all eyes on Gaza, it's important that more people draw attention because it really is an ethnic cleansing campaign across all of Palestine. And so this is the EU. This is from Al Jazeera from December 11th. EU mulls sanctions on violent Israeli settlers in occupied West Bank. So the EU's foreign policy chief, their top diplomat, Joseph Borrell, said that the bloc is alarmed by the deadly violence in the occupied territory by what he called extremist settlers. The European Union's top diplomat says he will propose sanctions on Jewish settlers who are violent against Palestinians in the Israeli-occupied West Bank. Borrell on Monday said that the bloc was alarmed by the violence in the West Bank by extremist settlers. He's condemned the Israeli government's decision to approve 1,700 new housing units in Jerusalem in what Brussels considers a violation of international law, which of course it is. Now, the time has come to move from words to actions and to start adopting the measures we can take with regard to the acts of violence against the Palestinian population in the West Bank, Borrell told reporters following a meeting of EU foreign ministers in Brussels on next steps regarding the Israeli war on Gaza. Now, since the 7th, settler attacks have more than doubled against Palestinians, according to the UN, combined with raids by Israeli forces. This number has gone up since this article was published. It's at least 286 Palestinians have been killed in the occupied West territory, so East Jerusalem and the West Bank. Actually, I think that figure refers East Jerusalem, the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. So, and that includes at least 63 children, with another almost 3,400 people injured. Now, while Borrell said ministers were not entirely enthused about the proposed measure, he will work with EU officials to draw up a list of prominent settlers who have engaged in attacks. And the foreign policy chief is yet to submit a formal proposal, but he said he will suggest that settlers be sanctioned for their human rights abuses. He did not give details about the sanctions, but EU officials have said they will include bans on travel to the EU, a challenging proposal, some diplomats say, because Austria, the Czech Republic, and Hungary are staunch allies of Israel. So they just point out that last week, Israel's biggest ally, the U.S., imposed a visa ban on settlers involved in attacks on Palestinians in the West Bank. And France last month said that it was considering such measures, while Belgium said it will ban settlers from the country. So Israeli settler violence has surged this whole last year since Netanyahu's far-right government came to power in December of 2022. Which itself includes ultranationalist settlers like Itamar Ben-Gvir, the national security minister, and Bezalel Smotrich, the finance minister, who also has a position in the defense ministry that effectively makes him the governor of the West Bank. Now, Israeli settlements in the occupied West Bank, considered illegal by much of the world, are built on territory that Israel conquered and then has occupied since 1967. After this Israel War of the 67 War, the Six Day War, the number of settlements in the occupied territory has increased dramatically in the last decade. And of course, this violence against Palestinians is just part of a larger ethnic cleansing campaign. But as I said, it's going into hyperdrive right now while everybody's eyes are on Gaza. And so Burrell said that he would propose a separate sanctions program against Hamas, although that there won't be much opposition there. As they point out, the EU already declares them a terrorist organization. So I guess you have to do both to cover your flanks politically. So, okay, this next story, this last one I have today, is pretty brutal. Israeli forces block ambulances from reaching besieged hospitals in Jenin. So there have been several attacks on Jenin throughout this year. Brutal one in July where they, tore up. They sent in Apache helicopters, drones, and armored vehicles, and about 1,000 troops, and bulldozers to tear up the roads and the water and electricity networks. And then they killed about 12 people, including, I believe, 5 children. So Jenin has historically been a center of resistance in the West Bank. And so since the 7th, they've launched numerous raids on Jenin and killed almost 60 people there alone. And I should point out that with how many people have been killed in the West Bank now since the 7th, the death toll in the West Bank just for this year alone is approaching 500. In fact, I believe it might be over 500. At this point. So Israeli forces block ambulances from reaching these hospitals. So the Israeli army has been obstructing the access of ambulances to hospitals on their way to transport Palestinians who have been wounded in an ongoing large-scale raid on Jenin City, now in its 3rd day. So at least 12 people have been killed so far and dozens more wounded since the Israeli military launched its raid on Jenin and its refugee camp on Tuesday. Israeli forces have also besieged hospitals in the city, blocking anyone from entering or exiting. On Thursday, soldiers shot and killed a 17-year-old boy named Musa Khatib inside the Khalil Suleiman hospital compound. And this is per Doctors Without Borders in a post on Twitter. Now, Doctors Without Borders also said that Israeli forces have stopped ambulances outside the hospital from transporting discharged patients home. Paramedics and ambulance drivers are ordered out of the ambulances, stripped, and made to kneel in the street. The patients were left in the ambulances. First responders told Middle East Eye that Israeli forces had also been blocking ambulances from transporting to hospitals people who have been wounded in the raid. Among them was Fuad Abraha, who's 36, was shot on Tuesday afternoon and bled to death in the ambulance as the medical team waited for soldiers to allow them passage. Most of the wounded in the raid have either been denied access to medical care or arrested from inside the ambulances. Ambulance driver Khaled Al-Ahmed told Middle East Eye that Abraha was hit by a bullet in the thigh and then suffered severe bleeding. A medical team that had reached Abraha had tried to provide him with first aid but was interrupted and harassed by Israeli soldiers. The crew was initially stopped from transferring him to the ambulance. However, our crew insisted on completing their mission, and we succeeded in transferring him to the ambulance. But when we tried to move towards the hospital, the soldiers stood in our way and prevented us on the pretext that they wanted the wounded person's identity card, which he wasn't carrying. Now, checking the identity cards of the wounded is a new policy that the Israeli army has adopted since the start of the war on Gaza, especially in Jenin, in its attempt to arrest, quote, wanted persons. The medical crew then informed the soldiers that Abraha's condition was critical and he was in need of urgent medical care, but to no avail. Ahmed said that in an attempt to speed up the transfer process, we asked the soldiers to let us move a second ambulance to go to his house and bring the identity card. The soldiers held up the ambulance for more than a half hour, and a delay that led to Abraha bleeding out and dying inside the ambulance. Now, journalist Mahmoud Zakarna from Jenin told Middle East Eye that a number of residents recognized the deceased and told the soldiers his name, but they still refused to let the ambulance pass without obtaining his identity card. First, the paramedics were screaming and demanding that the wounded be transported immediately, but the soldiers didn't respond and kept pointing their weapons at the ambulance, preventing it from moving. Meanwhile, he said, Sick Palestinians weren't able to reach hospitals as the raid was underway. The Palestinian Health Ministry said that a 13-year-old special needs boy, Ahmed Samar, died on Tuesday as well because his father couldn't make it to the Khalil Suleiman hospital due to the violence. Zakarna said that while he was filming the Israeli military as they were storming the city, he saw a man walking the street as he carried his child, trying to reach the hospital. Samar had fallen seriously ill in the town of Yahmoun, west of Jenin, that morning. His father first drove him by car to the city, but the roads were blocked due to the raid, leaving him with no choice but to carry his son on foot. Samar arrived at the hospital already dead. The Palestinian Red Crescent Society said in a statement that the humanitarian situation in the Jenin camp is deteriorating as a result of the ongoing raid. There have been dozens of calls and requests for help that ambulances have not been able to answer because of the obstructions imposed by the Israelis, despite poor coordination, according to the statement. The Red Crescent said dozens of citizens are also in need of baby milk and bread, but have not been allowed to leave their homes in days. During the recent raids on Jenin, the Israeli army has repeatedly besieged hospitals in the city and prevented medical teams from moving outside. So the Doctors Without Border said after one of these people, Musa, was killed, since October 7th, we have seen Israeli forces fire live bullets at the Khalid Suleiman hospital, tear gas the hospital, block ambulances, humiliate and harass medical staff, and now they shoot and kill someone in the hospital compound. Wissam Bakar, the director of the Jenin Governmental Hospital, said that Israeli army vehicles had started their invasion of the city this week by besieging his hospital and preventing ambulance crews from leaving it. And the blockade hasn't only affected the wounded, he added, but also prevents sick people from reaching the hospital, including those with kidney failure, tumors, and maternity cases. 2 ambulances have come under Israeli fire while transporting patients suffering from kidney failure to the government hospital in Jenin. Bakr said that in addition to the state of confusion caused by the presence of military vehicles in the vicinity and the courtyard of the hospital, the soldiers also fired tear gas that reached into the hospital and caused many patients and employees to suffocate. Bakr added that the military's request for identity cards of the wounded as they are being transported is a, quote, very dangerous measure that medical teams in the city have repeatedly warned against. Additionally, during the attack on the hospital, a number of premature babies were at risk of inhaling the tear gas being fired at the courtyard adjacent to their ward. The nurses had to move them all to another smaller room to prevent them from suffocation. And that raid is still ongoing as we are recording this show right now. So we'll have more of an update on the next show. But it's what's going on in the West Bank is absolutely insane. I mean, especially libertarians, you can imagine the way we responded to lockdowns during the COVID regime. To have an occupying foreign military force imposing that on you and shooting you or your kids if you go out into the street or you do anything, it's absolutely totalitarian and just unacceptable for the U.S. to be supporting any bit of this. And these are the kind of things, I mean, what's going on in Gaza is bad enough and could seriously provoke a wider war, but I mean the same could be said for what's going on in the West Bank. I mean, this is only going to get worse in at least in the near term. And so it's very important that everybody keep an eye on this, as this could be another huge powder keg waiting to blow up.
All right, Connor. Thank you for coming on the show and sharing all the bad news with us today. We'll be back with more episodes next week. And please, if you can, head on over and make a contribution to the Libertarian Institute. Some of our listeners I know have made donations because, you've let our donation line at the Institute know that, you really like this show. And so if you are making a donation and you like the show, you can let them know. We appreciate that. That's really cool. And, always encouraging, even if the news is bad, that people are listening and do care about the message we're bringing. So we really appreciate all of your support and donations. Thank you,
Absolutely.
Connor.
Thank you, Kyle. Thank you, everybody.